For those of you who don't know me, I'm Sue Ball and I'm the chair of the Thorney Island Society. And behind the scenes, making this all happen is Jules Shellebir, our secretary. But before I introduce you to Andrew, I would just like to mention the next date in the Thorney Island Diary, which is the 23rd of February, when Victor Keegan, our committee member and well known to most of you, will be talking about where is Thorney Island. Now, I think that's going to be a terrific talk because I'm always being asked that, and I think I'll know a little bit more after Victor's spoken. But it's just one of a really exciting program that Jules is putting together. She's almost finalized all the details, so by the end of the week they should be up on our website and on Eventbrite, but just putting a few things together. And to those of you who aren't members of the Thorney Island Society, I really encourage you. We're welcoming you here this evening. It would be marvellous if you would join the society. There's a huge amount of activity that goes on to do with planning, educational outreach, and the work in the community and so on, a voice for, especially on planning and particularly, and all support is really welcome, especially at this time. So do visit our website and join us. But anyway, to this evening's talk on the buildings of the Green Park, given by Thorney Island Society member Andrew Jones. Now, Andrew is a local. He's lived in Piccadilly for 15 years, and he's relatively recent, but a huge contributor to Thorney Island Society. So a big welcome to you, Andrew. He trained as an international lawyer, and as he will explain during his talk, he's spent lockdown 1 becoming a researcher and an author too, and I really wish I have been as productive as you, Andrew, during that period. But anyway, Andrew is going to talk for about 30 minutes, followed by Q&A. And if after he's spoken, you would like to put your name into the chat, preferably, or raise your hand in some way, Andrew or Jules will see you and then ask you to ask your question. So it's a great pleasure, Andrew, to hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Sue. And it's extremely nice to be here. Thank you very much for welcoming me. I'm going to share my screen with you so you can see the slides. Hopefully you can see that, Sue, can you? Great. So I'm going to talk about 3 things. First of all, I never had any intention of writing this book. It's an entirely accidental occurrence. So I'm going to tell you about how the book came about. I'm going to tell you about some of the buildings I wrote about and give you a flavour of the book, and then talk to you about how the book was designed and published. It's a book which is about Green Park, but it's also a book which is about how we've all adapted to the last few months of strange life. In my case, it's a story about how I've rediscovered where I live. So this was me in 2019. I was sitting on the edge of Green Park, and from there I would go to the world. I was traveling quite a lot. I was going all over the world for a variety of reasons, mostly connected with my job. And for me, Green Park was the most wonderful place to come back to at weekends, occasionally have a picnic, or occasionally just walk through it to go to Victoria and go to Gatwick again, or to Glyndebourne, or wherever I was going. But it was a place which I loved but didn't know very much about at all and didn't use properly. When I traveled, I used my Instagram a lot. I love looking at buildings, architecture. So I was doing little pieces about what I was seeing, showing people the delights of modernism in Congo, or some temple in Japan, or wherever I was at the time. So I was already starting to sort of record things. Anyway, then came March 2020, and this turned into this, which is really not a bad change, but it obviously the world shrank somewhat, so this was my life. And on that first day of lockdown, I decided that I had all this extra time. I had an hour extra time of commuting or non-commuting. So I thought I'd use our hours allowance, which we got in the first lockdown for exercise, to get to know the park, do some exercise, and then on the first day in the park, I looked around where I was, and I recognized a few buildings. I recognized 26 St James's Place, Spencer House, Lancaster House, a few houses, but I realized actually I didn't know very much about them. So I started with Lancaster House, and so here is the kind of the map of the park. Buckingham Palace down here, St James's in the corner, Queen's Walk and the Ritz and the tube station, Piccadilly and Hyde Park Corner. So I started with Lancaster House, and I essentially just walked up Queen's Walk, really just writing about one building a day, and then carried on down Piccadilly. And I think that took about 48 days. It was a very long lockdown, that one. And then I was enjoying myself so much that I then decided, well, I was relieved to see that there were lots of monuments and structures and memorials I could write about as well. So that's where the blue dots came about. I essentially started going back the other way and writing one little piece a day. So after 65 days, which was kind of more or less exactly the same length as the first lockdown, I discovered that I had actually written quite a lot. And at that point, various friends started saying, well, are you going to put this into a book? This was my everything, really. This iPhone. It was my my camera. It was my access to the internet. It was the thing I wrote my pieces on. And Instagram was the kind of format in which I wrote it. So Instagram, as many of you know, has got a very prescribed format. You can only put in 2,200 characters. So that was a kind of limit on what I could do, a sort of extended haiku. And it was also a daily dialogue. It became my social life, because as I posted pieces about the buildings, friends and acquaintances would respond, would tell me more about things I didn't know, would say, you know, have you come across this building, or did you know that my great aunt lived here, or that my parents dined at the Ritz every day in the war, or other very useful information. And so there was this really nice daily dialogue which kind of added to the research. I had the sort of real-time reactions to what people liked and didn't like in what I was writing. And so it was both a kind of social thing and a kind of research thing all in one. The other side of research was kind of rather more old-fashioned and manual. I've been accumulating books about the neighborhood over the years. I never actually read any of them until March last year. I just sort of bought them because they amused me, and I thought they'd be useful one day, which indeed they were. And so I was able to dip into my little local library here, and there were some really quite fun things. So starting with 144 Piccadilly, or Hippydilly as it was known as. So that was a squatter camp in one of the buildings that was demolished then to become the Intercontinental on Hyde Park Corner. And it was this great sort of cause célèbre of the kind of early 70s or late 60s, when I think about 100 squatters occupied it. There was a lot of indignation about all the fornication and drugs and everything else that was going on in this abandoned house. And this rather curious novel was written about it. And then we had the marvelous leather armchairs, which is a crucial resource for Piccadilly, because Piccadilly was at one time the sort of heart of clubland, and when London seemed to be entirely made up of sort of bachelor clubs or gentlemen's clubs and not much else. And so that book was extremely useful. And the best bit about it is the P.G. Wodehouse introduction, which is, I think, the best foreword of any book ever written, apart from mine, of course. And then Reginald Colby's book about Mayfair, a town within London, is terrific. I'm sure many of you know it. And then there's the book about the Jones collection, which is not my own collection, but it is about John Jones, who lived at 95 Piccadilly. who was an incredibly successful military tailor, and who he was a bachelor. He had tailor shops in Dublin and London doing, I think, regimental apparel, and he did very well. And he bought this house on Piccadilly. Didn't have a carriage. It had quite a modest life, and he accumulated this extraordinary collection of mostly 18th century French furniture. And that became when he died, he left to what was then the South Kensington Museum, now the V&A, and that became really the core of the collection at the V&A. And so if you go to the European galleries in the basement of the V&A on the sort of Exhibition Road side, it's practically all John Jones, practically all the furniture that used to be in Piccadilly. So that was a very nice discovery as well. It's now it's the building which is on the left of the In and Out Club, which was the American club, a sort of rather thin, nice looking building actually, but it was the building before that where he lived. And then of course the sort of high point of my research was when we were released from lockdown, and Jules, who I've been corresponding with, welcomed me to the wonderful Thorney Island offices to look at the library there, which is full of useful things. So I had a very pleasant afternoon. It's probably about the first time I'd left home and Green Park in several months. Very lovely afternoon with Jules, and then Victor came in as well. It was a very jolly time we had, yeah. So that was the sort of icing on the cake of the research project. So a few things about some of the buildings now. So this is one of my favorite buildings, as much for its story as for its rather curious architecture, the Hard Rock Cafe. Now, this is obviously, at the end of Piccadilly. It has this fantastically sort of bonkers structure, this pediment on the roof, which I've always thought is a kind of postmodernism about 80 years too early. So you've got this classical pediment, and then suddenly this kind of white and green marble stripes, and then this curious kneeling caryatid holding this chimney. I mean, it is the most eccentric building. It's a building which Edward VII loathed because it totally ruined the view from Buckingham Palace Gardens. It was by far the tallest building in the neighborhood at the time. It was built by Culkers and Hemp, who built the riverfront of the Savoy and the Adelphi. So very fashionable, successful architects of the time. It was built as car showrooms and flats. And then in the early 70s, I think, the Hard Rock Cafe bought, or just got a sort of end of a lease, almost like a sort of pop-up, and it's been there ever since. Now, I've never been inside the Hard Rock Cafe, but I really want to go now. So perhaps we'd have a Thorney Island Christmas party there or something. Now, one of the extraordinary things about, well, there are two more extraordinary facts about this building. One is that the Hard Rock Cafe belongs to the Seminole tribe of Florida, and I find that incredibly pleasing because, as I'm sure a lot of you know, the Duke of Westminster owned most of Florida before independence. So I thought it's very nice to have some of Florida coming and owning a bit of Mayfair in exchange nowadays. And of course, the other thing which is amazing about this building is that it is on the site of where Lord Elgin rented a house, and where he built a shed in the garden, or a sort of, perhaps more than a shed, but a structure in the garden to accommodate the Elgin marbles. And so when the Elgin marbles first came to London, they were on Piccadilly. They were there for a number of years. People paying a lot of money to go and see them. It was a kind of early version of an RA blockbuster show, I suppose. And all sorts of curious entertainment happened around them. For example, a naked prize fighter, or a prize fighter was asked to stand naked in front of the sculptures so that people could admire how well sculpted, I suppose, both the sculptures and the prize fighter were. And it was a really kind of successful thing. And I think this kind of quirky caryatid here sort of holding up the chimney, I think is presumably a reference to this this marvelous Parthenon figure that is now in the British Museum. Now, as you walk up the Queen's Walk, up the side of St James's here, I guess the first thing you see is the Ritz. The first thing you're aware of is the Ritz, and the Ritz, for me, is a piece of 18th century France. Really, it has the kind of the sort of rather romantic, completely incongruous architecture of a sort of mini Versailles, and then of course at Piccadilly level you have that arcade, which is just like the Rue de Rivoli. So it is this kind of curious piece of Paris implanted in Piccadilly. But over the road you have the new-ish Devonshire House, which really is a piece of New York on Piccadilly, because it was built in 1928 by Thomas Hastings of Carrere and Hastings, so the same architect as the New York Public Library, and the same architect as what's now the Frick Collection. Henry Clay Frick's house on Fifth Avenue. So very much bringing a sort of New York style of apartment building. It was apartments to start with, and I think if you look at this building, and if you kind of either put a big tower in the middle, or extend those two towers on the side and bring the facade forward, you have a 1920s apartment building on Central Park West. It's a very similar sort of big neo-Italianate building, and actually a lot of the detailing around the windows, particularly on the lower two floors, are very, very Italianate. I think Pevsner refers to the gay Cinquecento language of the buildings. It's very cheery and Italianate. And of course, this building replaced Devonshire House, which was the Duke of Westminster's house, sorry, the Duke of Devonshire's house. This version of it was built by William Kent, and stood there until the 1920s. It had this enormous brick wall around it, which people hated at the time, and one of the ways in which I think people apparently and brick wall with big gates, so you couldn't see in it at all. And one of the ways in which the Devonshires apparently tried to kind of make it more popular was to bring the gates they had from Chiswick House, these very beautiful 18th century gates, to replace these wooden gates. And those are the gates which have survived, and the Devonshire gates opposite Half Moon Street in Green Park. So that's one piece of the old Devonshire House that's left. The other piece is the tube station, particularly the ticket office. The ticket office is in the old wine cellar of Devonshire House. So there's always a sort of silly joke you can make when you ask for an Oyster card. You can ask for a bottle of Chablis with it and see if they'll oblige you. And then you've got, of course, the interiors, and many of the interiors, some of them were sold off, some of the furniture was sold off at Christie's a few years ago, but a lot of the panels and the wainscoting and so forth are actually still at Chatsworth in storage. So we've got our piece of Green Park in I think it's Derbyshire. So yes, we've bits of Green Park everywhere. Now I know nothing or very, very little about trees. I feel rather embarrassed in front of all of you talking about trees, but this is the only piece about trees I've written in the book. It's the place that some of us know as the Pantheon. It is just in front of Spencer House. It is a lovely space because, particularly in summer when the leaves are out, the canopies of the trees don't quite meet in the middle, and they leave this little oculus through which you can see the sky, just as in the Pantheon in Rome. And most extraordinarily, the diameter of our Green Park Pantheon is exactly that of the Pantheon in Rome. It's 43 meters across. I haven't tried to climb it to measure it vertically, but it feels the right height as well. And the other thing about this, which is wonderful in terms of the parallels, is that the positioning of Spencer House is rather like the portico of the Pantheon outside in Rome, which has got, as many of you have seen, is you come in through a portico into a kind of vestibule, and then you go from there into the round space. So the portico and the pediment of Spencer House operates in the same way visually. But that's where the parallel ends, because there are only 13 trees, whereas everything's in measures of 28 in the Pantheon. But another story starts from there. So I was looking at this in summer, and there was a very spiritual looking lady who was trying to meditate, and except for the fact that I wanted to talk to her. So interrupting her meditation, I sort of gradually won her over, and she started telling me about the way, for many people, the Pantheon has this kind of New Age ley line significance. It's a kind of confluence of many, many ley lines that all seem to come to Green Park and end up here. So I was very intrigued by this, and I sort of went online, got out my iPhone again, and I found this piece by someone called Chris Street, who's a kind of, I suppose, a sort of home counties shaman, I suppose, and he writes about the Pantheon. It felt like I'd entered a different dimension. So quiet, so calm, so reassuring. I counted the trees, 11, 12, 13. I counted them again. Yes, there were 13. One for each of the Celtic lunar months of the year. Wow, spooky. What was this? A Druidic grove in the middle of Green Park? So we have Druids as well in Green Park, and I think that's what's so lovely, is that actually even something like a circle of trees appeals to everybody from the fervent neoclassicist right through to the sort of Sedona New Age person. Now, we don't know much about these trees and when they were planted. Well, we knew they were planted, I think, in about 1913 around a bandstand, and there's a little picture here in the corner, top right corner. The bandstand was demolished in the 70s, I think, and obviously the trees grew, but we don't have any record of as to whether there was anything intentional about the diameter of them, but the effect is there, and it's wonderful. And I don't know how the ley lines came to be laid, or whatever you do with a ley line, but a lot of mystery around this place. It's very muddy at the moment, sadly, but come the summer, I recommend you go there. So the book goes on, lots and lots of chapters. A few more highlights very briefly. You've got marble art, which makes its way into this book because of the fact that obviously it used to be in front of Buckingham Palace, and so was what you saw from the park, and so looked onto the park essentially. And it's also interesting because so many pieces of marble art have gone elsewhere. So you've got the statue of George IV that was meant to be in the centre of it, is the statue in Trafalgar Square. You've got various goddesses of war that were repurposed. If you go to the National Gallery facade, you'll see them. They've had their spears taken out of their hands, and they're carrying easels and paintbrushes and palettes and so forth. So these kind of pacified goddesses. You've got various other pieces in Buckingham Palace. You've got a piece on the Euston Road. So again, Green Park dispersing around London. You've also got this the other half of the Hard Rock Cafe, which is in the old Coutts Bank, and you've got all the relics of which the Hard Rock Cafe is so famous for, which are displayed in the old bank vaults in the basement. So it's really worth going down to see that if you haven't been there, because you're going into this kind of Edwardian, first of all, banking hall, and then down into this safe, and actually the little night locker box is still in the wall outside. And the house was the house where Sir John and Letty Lade lived, who are very racy Regency characters. And then later the Marquis of Ansbach and Bayreuth, and it's so nice to have that connection with Bayreuth and Wagner going all the way to Hard Rock. This has always been a musical spot. And then finally, this marvelous plump little cherub who is meant to be Canada. Nothing Canadian about him, but there are two of them. There's one on the left where he's standing with a seal, and this one where he's got a fleece and lots of fruit. and that's part of the Victoria Memorial and the Canada Gates as you come up the up from Buckingham Palace into Green Park. Now onto some details of more about writing the book and how we actually turned it from Instagram to the book. So these are two very important parts of the process. My dear friend Ned, who is an extraordinarily talented designer, who when he's not helping me on Green Park is doing much grander things like doing the programs for Glyndebourne and other wonderful things. And he's a kind of uber designer because he really does, he goes way beyond graphic design. He will kind of, you know, explain to you why what you've written doesn't quite make sense and get really into the subject. So it was an enormous pleasure working with Ned. And then Alain de Botton, who I asked to write the foreword to, and who was following the Instagram, what I was posting. So we now move on to another very enjoyable part of writing this book, which was some sort of unearthing some of the kind of historical objects and pictures, starting with this lovely little ivory pass. Pre-1889, Constitution Hill was not open to public vehicles, and you needed to have some sort of a pass to use it. And so this is the Archbishop of Canterbury's little marble disc, and it is, and there were others of these handed out, and obviously this is very strict words that kind of once he stops being Archbishop of Canterbury, he has to give it back. You can't. It's not a kind of pass for life. And then lovely old photographs. This one I found in the Country Life archive, taken in the 1920s, of what was then the Isthmian Club, which was a kind of rather sporty club. It's of a stretch particularly that hasn't changed very much in many ways. So you've got Coventry House here, which is still here and is now the Eaton Square Senior School. This building is still there, although there's a tremendous sort of growth of mansards, which kind of totally ruins proportions, but this is the house in its original shape. You've got what's now the Japanese Embassy, which was built at the time as the Junior Constitutional Club. And actually, if you look up here on the chimneys, you've still got the cipher of the Junior Constitutional. And then on to the Badminton Club and the Junior Travellers Club, which are 100 and I think 98 Piccadilly. So in some ways very much the same street as we have it now, give or take the odd car. This building is I think a very elegant building. It's actually it was built very much in the shape of the previous building there. This building is by Thomas Cubitt, with changes by Alfred Waterhouse. It was built for the 4th Marquess of Hertford, who had an enormous picture gallery or picture collection, and it was built with galleries to house the pictures. The Marquess of Hertford never actually occupied it because he said it was so smelly there because of the River Tyburn going through it, that sort of trough in Piccadilly, that he then decided to move into a house a house with his collections in Manchester Square. And so obviously that became the Wallace Collection. And so we almost had the Wallace Collection in Piccadilly, but sadly the Tyburn was a bit too smelly for that at the time. Now it's obviously buried under the park. Although I think this weekend it was really, there was a lot of flooding where it should go, so I was wondering whether it was kind of rising up from below. Before that, again in racy Regency times, it belonged to the house. Belonged to the Earl of Barrymore, who the Prince Regent had called Hellgate because he was such a sort of furiously dangerous person. And he had four siblings, also nicknamed by the Prince Regent. There was Cripplegate, his brother with the club foot. There was Newgate, his youngest brother. And then there was Billingsgate, who is his sister, who was known for her swearing, and so Billingsgate seemed an appropriate name for her. Then after the Isthmian Club, it became the Hotel Splendide, and Cole Porter would always stay there, and I found letters from Cole Porter written on Splendide writing paper. Francis Day would sing there at night. And then in the 70s with the Arts Council. And then now it, I think, is a sort of rather discreet, elegant office block, possibly with some flats upstairs. A sort of temporary resident of Piccadilly, who I've always rather admired because he's just so louche, is King Zog of Albania. In 1939, Mussolini dethroned him, and so he had to leave rather quickly. He managed to pack quite a lot of gold on the way out, and he also brought with him an entourage and his right-hand man, this very slippery-looking character called Mr. Martini. And Mr. Martini, who really is the man from Del Monte in terms of his suit, I think, would look after King Zog's every need, and that included every week paying the bill at the Ritz in gold. So we all need our Mr. Martini, I think. I can't resist telling you about the printing, because I mean, obviously being a first-time author, everything like this excites me. So this is a little video of the book being printed in Slovenia, in a place called Maribor, which used to be called Marburg when it was part of the Habsburg Empire in Styria. It's a very old printing press from 1795. It's been modernized obviously since, but it was a kind of frustration of lockdown not being able to travel and see the book being produced. But the very nice people there sent me these lovely clips of the book being made, and so here, one of these could be yours. So there we are. That's our little printing activities. Now the other late pleasure in producing this book was choosing the end papers, and these and the lovely Daniel Crouch, the map dealer in St James's, allowed me to use some fantastic maps. I'd seen this map at Masterpiece Fair a couple of years ago. It's John Roke's map of 1746. It is immense. It covered a whole wall in his stand. It must be about 2 meters by 3. Every sheet, and you can just see a bit of sort of extract of the sheet here, is a sort of A4 size, so really beautifully detailed. So it's a real treat. So this is a tiny extract of it. And 1746 is very interesting. So you've got St James's Park, which is pre-Nash, sort of laid out rather like the sort of Tuileries Garden or somewhere, very, very formal and French, I suppose. You've got Buckingham House, not yet a palace. You have Green Park, which is rather larger than it is now. You've got Mayfair, which is a sort of out of town sort of development, really, I suppose. You've got the roads laid out, but no buildings built in a lot of it. You've got some orchards left here, roughly where Shepherd's Market is. Park Lane's looking a bit bare, but it's coming together. You've still got Devonshire House with its enormous gardens going almost as far as Berkeley Square. And then it's the countryside. Belgravia doesn't exist at all. And a few other features, like you've got the reservoir in Green Park, which was there until the 19th century. You've got the Park Rangers Lodge, which was a kind of grace and favour house by Robert Adam, still standing in the park. And then, so that's the front end paper, and then we skip forward about 100 years, or less than 100 years, to this map of 1839 by John Shurey, where really it's kind of modern London in terms of starting again with St James's Park. John Nash has made it very much as we know it now, all very picturesque and far from the kind of very formal style of before. Green Park is sadly much reduced, with half of it being expropriated by Buckingham Palace, which is now a palace, so ending at Constitution Hill. Mayfair is Mayfair more or less as we know it, so it's a properly developed. And then suddenly there's this new neighborhood of this kind of Dubai here of Belgravia, all these kind of brand new buildings, all looking very, very tidy and all laid out beautifully. And And so those maps were an enormous treat to find, and it's given me a real taste for cartography. So I started this talk telling you about the way in 2019 I was really going from Green Park into the world. And I like to think that 2020 was the reverse. I brought the world to Green Park. And the reason I put up this map is it's a map of some of the places where I had book orders when I put the book on my Instagram account. And I sent my first batch of books to. So everywhere from Sydney to Seattle via Los Angeles and Tokyo and Sao Paulo. And I like to think the fact that, while we were in Green Park, everybody was coming to us this time. And then a couple of weeks ago, I wrote a piece in the FT, in the Financial Times online, in their Globetrotter series, which I think this bit is open access. So even if you don't subscribe, you can see it. And after a week or two, I called the editor and asked if it had been well received, and she told me that it had been read by 11,000 people in 120 countries. So we've brought 120 countries into Green Park now, and it's still empty. So we are very, very lucky, and it had a lot of nice comments and so forth. So we're spreading the word, but while keeping the park empty. So the book officially comes out at the end of this month or beginning of March, although our two locals here stock it, and I see there are various copies coming onto the internet as well now. So but I think the link to Hayward Hill was circulated by Jules. So yes, I hope you enjoy the book in due course. There is a copy in the library, in the Thorney Island Library, so that's another option, is you have a lovely afternoon with Jules, like I did, and maybe Victor will drop in, and Jules is showing the copy that's actually not in the library, it's in our house actually, but should be in the library. Yeah, so that's our local bookshops, support our local bookshops. And so I thought I would end just with this lovely picture from 1797 of the Queen's Walk. So we're standing really sort of just beyond Green Park Tube Station, looking towards the Ritz nowadays. So Piccadilly's on your left. The Ritz would be in this gap here. This is Wimborne House, which still stands. It's obviously now part of the Ritz. William Kent House, they call it, because it is the William Kent building. It's a rather distorted proportions, but it's very much the same. And there are various other things that are still familiar. So here you have Rutland House, which is still half of the Royal Overseas League and Park Place. So that hasn't changed. You can see Spencer House, and so the main thing that's changed really is that the reservoir is no longer there. But otherwise, I think things are more or less the same, including the kind of people who come to the park. This rather sort of elegant if quirky couple here, rather adorable dog. I mean, nothing much has changed, I think. So that is all I'm going to tell you about. And please, let's move on to questions. I'm sorry about the little gap we had in the middle, but yeah, that's my IT for you. So hopefully, if you've got questions, just type them into your chat box, and then we can, or just say you have a question, and then we can ask you to unmute and to ask your question.
Certainly, I can see, Andrew, that Anne has said everyone's nightmare for one of these events is the screen, the pictures just suddenly disappearing. Yeah.
We're all very tolerant. Thank you very much. How does a tailor afford to live on Piccadilly? So that is a very very interesting question, because it is. I think it's probably the reason for it is that being a tailor was a big deal if you were successful, and if you had enough regiments and you were in several places around the world, it was probably a very lucrative thing to do. And he was a very austere man. Apparently, he didn't have a carriage. He was kind of he was focused on one thing apart from tailoring, and that was furniture. So yeah, it is it's something I've often asked myself. But I suppose if you have a big clothing business, that's lucrative. The racy Regency pair, Trisha asks, I think the ones I was talking to, I shall stop sharing my screen, yeah. The racy Regency pair, that was John and Letty Lade, who were an amazing couple. Particularly her, she was a I think she worked in an inn, if that, and she went out with a famous highway robber, and then she was eventually found by the Prince Regent's brother Frederick, and then she met this other racy character, Sir John Lade, who was an enormous gambler, and then they lived there, and then he eventually went bust through his gambling, and then he was bailed out by the Prince Regent under a pseudonym, which was some priest's name, and he lived on a sort of totally corrupt pension, pretending to be the Prince Regent's tutor. Now, The Freaks of Mayfair it is an interesting book. It's more fictional. It's a very quirky book, but it's not the best book, but it has got the best cover. So yeah, it is a one to look out for, Jules. And an anecdote. Kathy, do you want to tell us everybody before we can see this, Kathy?
I'm not. Yeah, I was in Green Park a couple of years ago, and I think it was a Japanese tourist, came up to me, pointed to Devonshire House and said, "Tell me, is that Windsor Castle?" So unfortunately, I had to disillusion him, but I should have said yes. But anyway,
that's fantastic. Any more? Who was the architect of the Hard Rock Cafe? Yeah, so it was Colcott and Hemp. Let me just check my notes there. Yeah, Colcott and Hemp, and they did the Savoy and they did the Adelphi, which is that building along from the Savoy in John Adams Street, I think. Victor.
So this is not really a question, it's an observation. That after your fascinating piece about the trees, I happened to see a tweet yesterday, I think it's from Mark Vasilewski, I don't know if he's here, saying that there were actually intended to be 14 trees and they left a gap, and that there's a much bigger gap between those two trees than the others. And I went up to check it out this morning, and you can see that there is a much wider gap in the two trees going towards Spencer House. And apparently it's because there was a pathway at some stage that had to go through the trees, and so there were originally intended 14.
Well, which also sort of adds to the portico effect of Spencer House being positioned like the portico of the original Pantheon.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and I suppose the path would have linked the bandstand and the to the Queen's Walk, and there's some great aerial views of the bandstand with dozens of deck chairs around it. I mean, when people really did used to go and listen to concerts in the park.
Bring it back. Bring it back.
Quite.
We're not going to ask you today.
Sorry.
Okay.
And then Emily Campbell asks, who are the weird spies that I've seen peering out from a first floor window on Piccadilly? So I think you're talking about what is now numbered 100 Piccadilly, which is the corner building on White Horse Street, which is that rather yellow building, or orangey yellow building, kind of classical building. And you're right, there were some very, very odd spies there. They were these mannequins. They were KGB sort of Soviet sort of era neo spies, and they were in the window for months on end, and it was part of a reality sort of TV film happening, and it's hours and hours long, called DAU, D-A-U, and it was this Russian director who he took over a disused public bath in Belarus, I think, and this building on Piccadilly, and he filmed about the Cold War and Soviet times, and he put these really sinister KGB agents and 1-2 Russian soldiers in the window of 100 Piccadilly, sort of peeping, sort of curtain twitching as you walk past. Sadly, they were taken out just a few weeks ago. But there are a few pictures in my book. But yes, if you go onto the BFI website, there's some quite funny clips and things about that. And then Mark tells us, yeah, bandstand 1986 to 1980. Thank you very much. And then why was the original Grand Devonshire House demolished and replaced? Well, I think, as I understand it, the family hardly used it, and I think the Duke of Devonshire at the time was actually in Ireland. He was governor of Ireland or something, I think, at the time, and I think it was just kind of unfashionable at the time. All the grand houses were being replaced. Probably amazing premium to be paid, and if you weren't using it, you know, the world had moved on. So in the same way that you know, Brooke House and Grosvenor House and all those buildings on Park Lane were going sort of in the 20s and 30s and 40s. I mean, Devonshire House went as well. Any more questions? We're almost at the end of our hour, but sorry, go ahead.
Eagle, no?
Sorry. Oh, hi, Andrew. Brilliant presentation. Seems you might have set up like a nice series potentially. Do you have any, are there any sequels in the future, with or without lockdowns, of course?
Well, it's very tempting to do lots more, because I suppose now that one starts to kind of unravel everything that exists around us, I mean, you can just keep going in more or less any direction. I mean, Green Park is particularly pleasing. St James's Park has got some pretty nice surroundings, and actually some of the streets, Piccadilly, St James Street, I mean, you could really, I mean, I don't know if people have got the appetite to read gazetteer after gazetteer of buildings, but I've got the appetite to research them. So I definitely room for sequels. Diana asks if any bombs hit Green Park, and I don't. Well, the bombs sort of, yes, but well, bombs hit the edge of Green Park. So in the Second World War, bombs hit the In and Out Club and Half Moon Street, and there's bomb damage to the front of the Ritz. But the Ritz actually is really interesting. It survived, I think, various bombs because of our dear bureaucrats, in the sense that it has this very American 1900s structure of essentially being self-supporting without load-bearing walls, but the building regulations were not, just didn't recognize this, so they had to build load-bearing walls as well as a self-supporting structure. So it's sort of doubly fortified building, the Ritz. And so people say that that's one of the reasons why the Ritz survived. And I think there are various, but I don't know if any bombs actually fell into the park. Does anybody know that?
Yes, hello. It's Mark here. When London Underground were rebuilding the tube station to put in the step-free access in time for the Olympic Games, they actually had to consult the maps of ordnance that had dropped in Green Park, and I do have a copy of it stored electronically somewhere. But yes, they did show there were 1 or 2 bombs up in that northeast corner of the park that did fall. And of course, there was a substantial air raid shelter put in just to the south of Green Park Tube Station as well during the war as well. So certainly, yes, they do have a map that shows that.
And apparently that you could have lunch at the, you could have, one of the tragedies of lockdown is the Ritz has been closed, and the flag's been down, and it's been dark, and it's been such a sort of sad sight to have the Ritz closed for so long. And it didn't close during the war, and they had this extraordinary dining room in what, well, it's now also closed, the casino underneath, the old ballroom, and they created this dining room in the Ritz, which was full of sandbags. So you know, so you could have your caviar and your grouse and everything among the sandbags, and they kept serving meals there throughout the war. And it's very interesting, the whole thing about eating in the war. So all these clubs in Piccadilly, people, if you weren't out fighting, the thing to do was to join 2 or 3 clubs so that you could deal with the rations by having 3 lunches every day. So you just had your rations and club. So you start in the St James's Club and maybe go on to Boodles and end up at the Carlton, and you'd have a proper meal in total.
Could I ask a question, Andrew? Do you have a favourite grand house amongst your collection?
Well, among those that are left, I think Coventry House, which is the school, is very, very lovely. So that is just next to the Sheraton, the Park Lane Hotel. It was at Korean University, and now it's a school. It's really good inside. So if you do get the chance, maybe during architectural open day, it has a lovely Robert Adam drawing at the front. It used to be both the St James's Club and the Bachelor Club, which was this wonderful club for bachelors. And if you got married, you had to pay a fine to the club, and that allowed you to remain a member or get expelled. And actually, there are these notice boards of various war memorials to bachelors who fell in the war. And architecturally, it's really, really nice inside, and it's quite nice because the school hasn't overdone it. So it's got a lovely painted ceilings and wonderful fireplace. So I think that's probably my favourite building. But I do love Bridgewater House as well. I think Bridgewater House is an incredibly glamorous, sort of almost Riviera-like structure in a slightly more sort of luxurious Regency way.
Okay, Andrew, if there aren't any more questions, I can see there's something from Joanna there. But actually, I think probably from what you've said, Andrew, you may have a couple more commissions for future publications. So can I just thank you warmly and hugely from all of us here at the Thorney Island Society. I mean, exquisite detail.
Thank you very much. Lovely seeing you all.